in this section we are going to talk about other types of scholarly output and open access publishing. We talk about new developments a bit. So what's important to keep in mind in the whole transition towards open access publishing, that it is about more than only journal publishing. What we witness is that internationally oriented journal publishing is an important way of communicating and disseminating research results in the so-called STEM domains, so that's science, technology, engineering and medicine. But we've also witnessed that over the last decade or so, 15 years, the development of open access publishing particularly aimed at changing the journal publishing landscape. So other types of scholarly publishing that are common in other domains have received less attention. So for example, if we take a look at conference proceedings papers, which is a common way to communicate your scholarly developments and your outputs with colleagues, is quite common in engineering. So in engineering, submitting your abstracts or your papers to a conference organization and thereby publishing it in the accompanying proceedings papers is a common thing to do. We also see that these books have a rather diverse way of appearing. So sometimes they are freely accessible or available, but then they are not systematically disclosed. So it is very difficult to get on a global base an insight on what is there as scholarly literature in proceedings papers. The more so because bibliographic systems like we know for journal publishing, like the Web of Science or the Scopus database or the Dimensions database, do not exist for proceedings papers. So scholars, engineers who use conference proceedings papers do not have a similar access to proceedings papers. Increasingly, these proceedings papers were published by societies and publishing houses. So what we witness is that also these resulting proceedings papers have disappeared behind paywalls over the last 15 to 20 years. So we have a similar problem as we have seen for journal article publishing. And it gets perhaps even a bit worse. Because in other scholarly domains, open access publishing is lagging behind even somewhat more than compared to conference papers. Because in the humanities and some social sciences, scholarly communication differs even stronger from the STEM domains. If we think about Cielo, the Brazilian system of scholarly literature disclosure, that covers a lot of locally oriented journals. And these locally oriented journals are very often published in local languages. That can be in the Latin American context in Portuguese or Spanish, thereby addressing local problems to local audiences. Something different than you witness in the STEM domains, where the audience is an internationally oriented English-speaking peer community. And what we also witness in the humanities and some social sciences is that book publishing in the form of monographs or edited volumes is still the main way forward in the dissemination of scholarly results. So open access for books is also something that we would strive for. And like I said, in the Dutch situation, it has been exempted from the mandate. But one of the main problems, and I've talked to many book publishers about this, is that it is very difficult to determine the particular book publishing charges, because unless the journal publishing where you have subscriptions, it is clear what would be more or less the expected turnover of a publisher, which is not so much the case in the area of book publishing. So funding instruments very often cover APCs for journal publishing, but they do not cover the funding for getting your books or your edited volumes published. However, I must say here that NWO has already filled that gap by organizing particular funding for open access books, whereby researchers who do publish normally in books and edited volumes can address their issue and apply for additional funding for getting their books and edited volumes open access accessible. Now we will talk about pre-registration, a somewhat newer form of quality control that you see more and more appearing. And two young colleagues will introduce this topic to you in the next couple of minutes.
Pre-registration in 5 minutes.
Well, that's what we planned.
I'm Anne Scheel. I study meta science currently at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and Leiden University.
And I'm Anna van Veer. I study methodology and research integrity, also at Leiden University.
On the landscape of responsible research practices and open research practices, pre-registration is part of the scientific process. So pre-registration adds transparency about how a study was conducted, how data were collected and analyzed, that is important for interpreting scientific results. A pre-registration is essentially an announcement that a study will be conducted. So in a regular scientific workflow where we first design a study, then collect some data, analyze the data, write up the results, and then try to publish them, the pre-registration is a time-stamped protocol of the study before we start data collection. And this protocol should contain details about the planned methods, the data that are supposed to be collected, and the analysis. To explain why this is important, I'm going to use an example from a blog post by Dorothy Bishop about the Amazing Significo. So imagine the Amazing Significo comes to you and tells you he can deal you a poker hand with 3 of a kind. So that is 5 cards and 3 of those are the same, which is a really good hand in poker. And he does that, he deals you 5 cards and you find that indeed you got 3 of a kind. I don't know about you, but I would be pretty impressed and would want to know what his trick was, assuming that he doesn't actually have magic powers. But now imagine that you learn that he had tried the same thing with 50 other people this morning and you're the first one where it worked. Now, personally, my impressiveness would drop to 0 because this is exactly how often you would expect such a thing to happen by random chance. So you would now think there is no trick involved at all. And this example shows that the context really matters for interpreting how impressed we should be by a certain result and which inferences we draw from it. So to interpret scientific results, we always need to evaluate how likely or unlikely they would be to happen through different processes. And this is why questionable research practices, such as selective reporting, where we cherry pick certain results that we like, can severely distort the evidence and lead to wrong conclusions. Pre-registration makes it easier to evaluate how impressed we should be by a certain outcome because we can see what the researchers had planned before they knew the results and how many different options they tried. And of course, this is particularly important when specific predictions are tested or when the stakes are very high, so for example in clinical trials about drug efficacy. But in other cases, when a study is very exploratory or descriptive, pre-registration might have less of a use and might not be necessary at all. But even in cases where no hypotheses are being tested, for example, it can help prevent hindsight bias. Pre-registration or just study registration was first used in medicine for clinical trials and has in the last 10 years become quite popular in psychology and also in other social and behavioral sciences like economics and political sciences. There are now several registries where researchers can upload their study protocols and where those protocols will then be timestamped and frozen, so a copy is made that cannot be altered anymore, and this frozen record can then either immediately be seen by anyone, so is immediately public, or will become public after a certain embargo period that the researchers can determine. Pre-registration doesn't mean that researchers can't change any of their plans anymore after they have been registered. In fact, it's very rare that everything goes according to plan. And it also doesn't mean that they can't run any analysis that haven't been planned. It is just important that those analyses that were not planned are really labeled as such in the final report so that they are marked as exploratory analysis, for example, and so that readers can draw the appropriate conclusions. But of course, pre-registration doesn't prevent researchers from misrepresenting their results or not reporting certain results. It just means that there is more transparency. So it is always up to the reader and reviewers to compare a final report with the pre-registration if it exists. There is one version of pre-registration, though, that goes further, called registered reports. And registered reports are actually a submission format offered by journals. Here, researchers don't just upload a study protocol themselves into a registry, but the study protocol is submitted to a journal and peer-reviewed. And if the peer reviewers agree that this is a great research question and a good way of studying it, then the journal gives the authors a so-called in-principle acceptance, meaning the journal commits to publishing the final report regardless of the direction of the results, so even if the results are negative. This offers quite powerful protection against selective reporting. And at least in psychology, we have some initial evidence that that seems to work in practice. In one of my own studies, we found that published registered reports were much more likely to contain negative results, so cases where the tested hypotheses were not confirmed, than regular articles. My personal experiences with pre-registrations are very positive, and I actually use it for all of my articles, including quite exploratory ones. For example, I just used it for a qualitative study that had no predictions at all, but it really helps me keep a record of my own state of mind was when I started a study, what I thought, and what I learned from the data over time. And as a meta researcher, pre-registration and registered reports have also been the subject of my study, of course. And my impression from my work so far is that it really has tremendous potential of changing science for the better and reducing many biases that distort published results. But I also think there are still a lot of problems we need to tackle. For example, I think we need greater standardization, both in terms of what templates are used, like how pre-registrations are actually conducted, but also how they are reported and how they are linked to final results or to the final reports, and who reviews that, how we can easily tell what changed from the pre-registration to the final report. I also think it's very important that pre-registration doesn't become a box-ticking exercise. So if it is more encouraged or more rewarded, we need to make sure that it's used well, that it can also really help researchers design stronger studies, and it's not used mindlessly.
For me, when I did my first registered report back in 2013, it was a bit of a shot in the dark. There were no guidelines or instructions that helped me know how to do this well. However, because my reviewers, although they were quite critical, could still suggest improvements to my plan, it felt like they became more like collaborators. This was super useful to me, being a PhD student at the time. After the plan was approved and the data was in, it was like a relief. I only had to run the analysis we planned, and maybe perhaps some exploratory analysis, but I did not have to fear that the results weren't good enough to sell. The results were just the results. And having gone through this process and realizing the benefits, I later wrote a discussion paper on pre-registration because I realized I wanted others to also know the pros and cons and to help them learn how to actually do this in practice. I believe that one of the most important skills that researchers need to develop in the future is the skill of planning ahead. I personally don't apply pre-registration in all of my research projects because, as with other tools, it's important to apply it where it is especially useful. But having applied it now many times, I've realized these things. That the types of projects you can use pre-registration for vary enormously. And that you can pre-register different parts of a study and that this will give you different benefits. And that with each time you take a stab at it, you get better and you reap the benefits even more. Looking at the broader picture, pre-registration is just one of the tools in a researcher's toolbox for responsible research. To help each other in learning in all these new things, we have open science communities within all the Dutch universities now. These communities function not only as a network that helps people learn from each other, they also help feed bottom-up knowledge and experiences back into top-down policy. Together with other open science initiatives like the reproducibility networks and methodological and meta-scientific studies like Anne and I now do, the goal is to jointly create a way of working that moves science forward in a responsible way.
Having listened to this video, it is clear that pre-registration is an important part of the transition in scholarly work. So perhaps a little bit beyond the topic of the research of the seminar today, but also still important enough to mention it because it is involved in the open access transition. So the question, of course, who is actually responsible for pre-registration? And until now, it is mostly academics that have to put in the effort to do this, to make the step to pre-register research. But what can funders do? Funders can actually stimulate the process of pre-registration by making it either an obligation or more voluntary option in the research that they fund. And until now, since pre-registration is a bottom-up initiative and development, there are no costs involved to make your work available.